Hello, my name is Jonathan, 36 years old, and I'm living in Seattle, Washington. I stand here on a trail leading up to Mount Rainier, the cold wind brushing across my face, carrying the scent of pine and the stillness of nature. From this vantage point, I can see snow-capped peaks and lush green valleys stretching endlessly. But today, I'm not just admiring the scenery. I'm reflecting on myself. A long journey from a boy who grew up in the shadow of others to a man who found his own light. This story begins in 2019 when I was 30, in Lansing, Michigan, a place where everything seemed to fall apart, but also where I began to learn how to stand back up. I grew up in the suburbs of Lansing, Michigan, in a modest red brick house with a white picket fence that had peeled over the years. My father, George, was an accountant, and my mother, Margaret, worked part-time at a used bookstore. We weren't rich, but we weren't destitute either. Our family consisted of 5. My parents, my older brother, William, 4 years my senior, always the pride of the family, and my younger sister, Emily, 3 years my junior, the pampered baby of the family. And me? I was Jonathan, the middle child, the one who seemed to always be stuck in some overlooked corner, never bright enough to be noticed. From a young age, I was used to being compared. William was the shining star of the family. He was smart, handsome, excelled in school, and always knew how to make our parents proud. At school, he was the captain of the basketball team, president of the student council, and earned a full scholarship to a prestigious boarding school at just 15. Meanwhile, I was just an average kid with mediocre grades and nothing remarkable to show for myself. Every time I brought home a report card with a few B's, my father would look at me, sigh, and say, "William always got A's. Why can't you try harder like him?" My mother was gentler, but her eyes always betrayed a hint of disappointment, as if I were a flawed version of my brother. Holidays were when I felt the difference most acutely. On Christmas, when I was 10, William received a science kit, the kind he could use to conduct chemistry experiments in his room. Me? I got a used toy car, one that William had already grown tired of. "Think of it as recycling, Jonathan," my mother said, smiling as if it were a brilliant idea. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about recycling. I was simply the second choice. I found solace elsewhere. Our neighbor, Uncle Fred, was a retired mechanic with a small garage behind his house, filled with tools and the smell of motor oil. Every weekend I'd run over there watching him disassemble car engines, fix lawnmowers, or tinker with broken electronics. "You've got skilled hands, Jonathan," he'd say, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "Not everyone needs to be a lawyer or a doctor. Just do what you love, and that's enough." Those words were a small ray of light in my world full of comparisons. But when I told my parents about Uncle Fred, my mother only frowned. "What good is fixing machines? William's going to law school. You should follow his example." I didn't hate William. He didn't try to make me feel inferior. Sometimes he'd even share his toys or help me with homework. But his shadow was too vast, and I didn't have the strength to step out of it. When William left for boarding school, I thought things would get easier. They didn't. My parents began comparing me to an idealized memory of William, a perfect version that didn't even exist. "When William was your age, he already had plans for his future," my father said when I hesitated about choosing a high school major. I just nodded, swallowing the bitter taste in my throat. When I was 18, I went to college with the help of a student loan. I chose mechanical engineering not just because I enjoyed it, but also because I wanted to prove I could accomplish something. College wasn't easy. I wasn't a genius like William, but I was diligent. I stayed up late in my dorm, poring over technical drawings and complex formulas. Some nights I sat alone in the library watching other students laugh and joke, wondering if I was working hard for myself or just to please my parents. I graduated with decent grades, not outstanding, but good enough to land a job at an auto manufacturing plant in Detroit. The starting salary wasn't high, but it was stable. I rented a small apartment and began my independent life. Meanwhile, William graduated from a prestigious law school in Chicago, with my parents' financial support to buy a nice apartment and start working at a major law firm. My parents never stopped talking about him, his successful cases, the lavish parties he attended. And me? I sent money home every month to help my parents pay off their mortgage and cover Emily's college tuition. But no one mentioned that. Once I sent $2,000 to fix a leaking roof. My mother called to thank me, but her tone was flat. "Thank you, Jonathan. But you know, William just gave us a $5,000 vacation." I gripped the phone tightly, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. "I'm happy for him," I said before hanging up. I wasn't angry at William. I was angry that every effort I made was overlooked, as if it were an obligation, while William's actions were treated as miracles. The job at the plant wasn't a dream, but I loved it. I enjoyed the feeling of fixing a machine, hearing the engine hum smoothly after hours of tinkering. My co-workers, a group of down-to-earth mechanics, became my friends. We'd gather at a bar after work, drinking beer and swapping stories. They didn't know about William or compare me to anyone. To them, I was just Jonathan, the guy who could fix a machine faster than anyone else on the shift. But then, in 2019, everything changed. The auto industry in Michigan began to decline. Economic downturns and automation led to layoffs at the plant. I received my termination notice on a rainy morning when the manager called me into his office and said, "Jonathan, you're a good worker, but we don't have the budget anymore." I stood there staring at the termination letter, feeling the ground collapse beneath me. I had worked hard, sacrificed time, money, and pride to prove my worth. Yet in a single moment, it all vanished. I depleted my savings after a few months of unemployment. Detroit had little to offer, and I had no choice but to return to Lansing, to the red brick house where I grew up. I packed my things, gave up my apartment, and drove my old car back home, my heart heavy. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd soon find a job and get back on my feet. But deep down, I knew what awaited me. My parents greeted me with a mix of pity and irritation. "Just temporary, right?" my father asked, his voice cold. "I'll find a job, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. My mother patted my shoulder, but her eyes said it all. She didn't believe I'd amount to anything significant. The first few weeks weren't too bad. I spent my days sending out resumes, calling companies, even driving to factories in nearby cities to apply in person. But Michigan's job market was brutal. Each rejection email made me feel smaller. And then, the comparison started again. One evening at dinner, my mother talked about William. "He just won a big case in Chicago," she said, her eyes sparkling. "His firm rewarded him with a vacation in Hawaii. Our William is truly amazing." I sat there picking at a piece of cold ham, saying nothing. My father glanced at me, his voice dry. "And you? Still no job?" I tried to explain that the market was tough, that I was doing my best, but he cut me off. "William never had to beg for a job. People came to him." I gripped my fork tightly, a fire burning in my chest, but I said nothing. I was used to staying silent. The months that followed were even worse. Utility bills piled up. My father began to complain, not directly, but through pointed remarks. "This house doesn't support freeloaders." My mother was gentler, but she talked about William more and more in my presence. I felt like garbage my parents wanted to throw away. I started to wonder if I was truly a burden. Each day I woke up hoping to find a glimmer of hope, a chance to prove I wasn't a failure, but each day brought only disappointment. I looked in the mirror and saw a 30-year-old man with disheveled hair and dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. I asked myself, what am I doing with my life? What's my worth? Christmas 2019 was approaching, and I decided to do something to change the mood. I spent weeks in Uncle Fred's old garage, now owned by someone else, but still lent to me. I crafted a wooden box carving an image of our family, my parents, William, Emily, and me, from an old photo taken when I was a child. I placed inside it mementos and photos, moments when I thought our family had been happy. I hoped this gift would remind them that I was still here, still part of the family. But I didn't know that Christmas dinner that year would change everything. On Christmas Eve 2019, our red brick house in Lansing was decorated as it always was. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, twinkling with colored lights and old glass ornaments. The smell of roasted turkey wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of cinnamon from the candles my mother had lit on the dining table. On the surface, everything seemed cozy, but I could feel a tense atmosphere like a guitar string pulled too tight, waiting for a single touch to snap. My parents were busy in the kitchen, Dad carving the turkey, Mom arranging plates. Emily, now 27, sat on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up to smile at me. William hadn't arrived yet, but I knew he'd make a grand entrance, as he always did. I placed the wooden box on the gift table next to the shiny, wrapped presents. It looked out of place with its rustic wood and imperfect hand-carved details. But to me, it held my entire heart. Memories of our family days when I believed we were truly close. I hoped that when my parents opened it, they'd see how hard I'd tried to hold on to those moments. "Jonathan, help me bring out the soup," Mom called from the kitchen. I hurried in, picking up a tray of steaming pumpkin soup and carefully setting it on the dining table. "Looks delicious, Mom," I said, trying to start a conversation. She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the door as if waiting for someone more important. I knew she was waiting for William. The doorbell rang and my heart tightened slightly. "He's here," Mom exclaimed, rushing to open the door. William stepped in, tall and imposing in an expensive wool coat, hair neatly combed, a confident smile on his face. He hugged Mom, clapped Dad on the shoulder, and handed them a bottle of red wine, the kind I was sure cost more than a week's wages from my old factory job. "Chateau Lafite, try it, it's amazing," he said, his voice warm and generous. Mom gushed. Dad nodded approvingly, and I stood there, feeling like I was fading into the air. "Jonathan, long time no see," William said, turning to me. He extended his hand for a shake, but his eyes slid past me quickly as if I were just part of the scenery. "You doing all right?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer before launching into a story about his recent business trip to New York. I nodded, quietly taking my seat at the table, trying to swallow the bitterness rising within me. Dinner began with William's stories. He talked about his big case in Chicago, the new apartment he was eyeing downtown, and the company-sponsored vacation in Hawaii. My parents listened, their eyes sparkling as if he were the star of a blockbuster movie. "That's my boy," Dad said, raising his glass of wine. "William, you make this family proud." Mom nodded, beaming. Emily occasionally chimed in with stories about college, but it was clear the spotlight belonged to William. He described a party with major clients, how he'd won over a tough customer. I tried to listen, but my mind wandered. I thought of my childhood days in Uncle Fred's garage, fixing an old radio and feeling like I mattered. I remembered my days at the factory when my co-workers patted my back for repairing a production line. But here, in my own home, I felt invisible. After the main course, Mom stood to open the gifts. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, but also the one that made my heart pound with anxiety. Emily gave our parents a piece of artwork bought with the money they'd given her. "It's beautiful, Emily," Mom said, hugging her. William presented an envelope containing a gift certificate for a weekend getaway in Napa Valley. "You guys deserve a break," he said, and the family clapped. I looked at my wooden box still sitting quietly on the table and told myself, they'll love it. They have to love it. "Jonathan, where's your gift?" Mom asked, her voice gentle but lacking enthusiasm. I stood, picking up the box, which felt heavier than ever. "I made this myself," I said, handing it to her. "I hope you all like it." Mom took the box, glanced at it briefly, then set it aside without opening it. "Thank you, Jonathan, but it's probably not necessary," she said, smiling as if to brush it off quickly. Dad didn't even look. He just took another sip of wine. I stood there, feeling like my heart was being crushed. The wooden box, the one I'd spent weeks carving, filling with carefully chosen photos and memories, was dismissed like a worthless trinket. I wanted to say something to explain that I'd poured my heart into it, but my throat tightened. I sat down, my hands clenched under the table, fighting back tears. The atmosphere at dinner grew heavier when William turned to me. "Hey, Jonathan, still no job?" he asked, his tone half joking, half serious. "You planning to stay here forever?" I felt my parents' eyes on me as if waiting for my answer to confirm that I was indeed a failure. "I'm trying," I said, my voice low. "The market in Michigan is tough, but I've got some leads." I tried to sound calm, but inside a storm was raging. William laughed loudly as if I'd told a joke. "Trying? You know, in Chicago, people line up to hire me. You should get out of this small town, do something big." He took a sip of wine, smug. I looked at Dad, hoping he'd say something to defend me, but he just nodded at William as if agreeing. "Jonathan, you should listen to your brother," Dad said suddenly, his voice cold. "Your mother and I are getting old. We can't keep supporting you. The utility bills have skyrocketed since you came back. You're a burden to this family." His words cut like a knife, slicing deep into my heart. Mom chimed in, her voice softer but sharp. "Why don't you follow William's example and stand on your own? At your age, he already had a career, a home of his own." I looked around the table. William smirked as if watching an entertaining play. Emily lowered her head, avoiding my gaze, clearly not wanting to get involved. And then, Dad said the final words I'd never forget. "If you disappeared from here, no one would notice. Living like this just bothers everyone." The air seemed to freeze. Blood rushed to my head, my heart pounding. Years of being compared, overlooked, and pushed aside all converged in this moment. I wanted to scream, to slam the table, to tell them how hard I'd tried, how much I'd sacrificed, but I didn't. I looked at Dad, then Mom, then William, and said, my voice so cold it startled even me, "If that's the case, consider me gone." I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. No one said a word. Mom opened her mouth as if to speak, but then fell silent. William shrugged as if it didn't matter. Emily looked at me, her eyes glistening, but she didn't get up. I walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, and closed my bedroom door behind me. In my old room, I sat on the bed staring at familiar objects, a faded basketball poster, a bookshelf full of engineering textbooks, and the alarm clock still ticking away. I felt like I was suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. Dad's words echoed in my mind. No one would notice. Was that true? Was I really worth nothing to them? I opened my closet, grabbed a backpack, and stuffed it with a few clothes. I looked around the room one last time, feeling like I was saying goodbye to a part of myself. But I knew that if I stayed here, I'd continue to be sidelined, living like a shadow. I had to leave. I went downstairs, put on my shoes, and opened the front door. The streetlights cast a dim yellow glow on the snow-covered street. I heard Mom call from the dining room. "Jonathan, where are you going?" But I didn't answer. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and felt the biting cold of the Christmas night. My old car was parked in the driveway, and I climbed in, starting the engine. It grumbled in protest, but eventually roared to life. As I drove out of Lansing, I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to disappear, not to hurt them, but to save myself. In the darkness, I felt both terrified and free. My father's words, though painful, had inadvertently opened a door. I wouldn't let them define me anymore. I would find a place where I was seen, where I was valued, even if it meant starting over from scratch. Snow fell gently on the windshield, each flake a reminder that I was leaving behind everything familiar. The old car creaked as I pressed the gas pedal, heading west on I-96. I had no clear plan, just a few $100s in my wallet, a backpack of clothes, and the wooden box sitting quietly on the passenger seat. On Christmas Eve 2019, while others gathered with their families, I drove alone, unsure of what the future held. But for the first time in years, I felt a new breath of air fill my chest. Not hope, but determination. I drove through the night, stopping only at a gas station to fill the tank and buy a bitter black coffee. The radio played Christmas songs, but I turned it off. The cheerful music only reminded me of the dinner I'd just left, of my mother's indifferent glance as she set the wooden box aside, of my father's words, "If you disappeared, no one would notice." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, telling myself they were wrong. I would prove I had worth, not for them but for myself. After days of wandering, I decided to head to Seattle, Washington. I'd once heard Sarah, a college friend, talk about the city, its thriving tech industry, opportunities in engineering, and the beauty of its mountains and sea. Sarah and I had been close in college, but after graduation we'd only exchanged occasional texts. I wasn't sure if she'd remember me, but Seattle was the best option I had. It was far from Michigan, far from my family, far from William's shadow. If I was going to disappear to rebuild myself, this was the place to start. I sent Sarah a short message. "Hey, I'm thinking of moving to Seattle. Any suggestions?" I wasn't sure she'd respond. But to my relief, Sarah replied enthusiastically, "Jonathan, it's been forever. Seattle's awesome. Come on over. I can help you find a place." She sent me details about a cheap but clean apartment in Capitol Hill. I didn't hesitate. I sold my old car for next to nothing, scraped together enough money for a Greyhound bus ticket, and set off. Seattle greeted me with drizzle and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the streets. I stepped off the Greyhound bus, dragging my backpack, feeling like an immigrant in a new land. The apartment Sarah recommended was a small room on the third floor of an old building, with a window overlooking a graffiti-covered alley. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a place to start over. One evening, Sarah invited me to a coffee shop downtown. "My company's looking for a mechanical engineer for a renewable energy project," she said, sliding a flyer across the table. "It's a small startup, but they need someone with your experience. Give it a shot." I looked at the flyer, my heart racing. Renewable energy, something I'd read about in college but never had the chance to explore. "I'm not sure." I hesitated. Sarah grabbed my hand, her voice firm. "Jonathan, you can do this. Don't doubt yourself." I applied, and a week later I was called for an interview. It took place in a cluttered office filled with blueprints and wind turbine models. The interviewer, an engineer named Mark, asked about my experience at the auto plant and the projects I'd worked on. I talked about fixing production lines, how I'd optimized an engine system to save 10% energy. Mark nodded, jotting notes, and finally said, "Can you start part-time? If it goes well, we'll bring you on full-time." I agreed immediately. It was the first glimmer of light I'd seen since leaving Lansing. The job at the startup, Green Wave Technologies, was a whole new challenge. I worked in a small team designing renewable energy systems, mainly wind turbines and solar panels for rural communities. I wasn't the best on the team, but I was diligent. I learned about programming and system design, spending hours in the office tinkering with 3D models on the computer. My colleagues, Mark, Sarah, and a few other engineers, didn't compare me to anyone. They judged me by what I did, by the ideas I contributed. One day, Mark called me into his office. "Jonathan, got any ideas to improve turbine efficiency?" he asked. I pitched an idea I'd been mulling over. A new blade design, inspired by old car engines that could reduce friction and boost efficiency by 15%. Mark listened, nodded, and said, "Sounds good. Try it out." For the first time, I felt respected, seen. When the prototype succeeded, the team clapped and Mark patted my shoulder. "Great work, Jonathan. You were born for this." I was hired full-time after 3 months with a salary that let me move out of the Capitol Hill apartment and rent a place near Puget Sound, where I could hear the waves crashing every morning. But more than the money, the job gave me something I'd never had: confidence. I started to believe I had value, that I could make a difference. But the past didn't let go easily. The wounds from my family lingered like scars beneath the skin. Some nights I lay in bed listening to the rain outside my window, remembering my father's words, my mother's gaze, William's smug smile. I knew I needed to do something to heal. Sarah suggested therapy, and though I was skeptical at first, I decided to try. My therapist, Dr. Elena, was a middle-aged woman with a gentle but incisive voice. In our first session, I told her about my family, William's shadow, and that Christmas Eve. She listened without judgment and asked, "Jonathan, where do you think your worth comes from?" The question stopped me cold. I'd always thought my worth depended on how my parents saw me, what William thought of me. But Elena helped me realize that my worth came from within, from what I did, who I helped, and the person I chose to become. Therapy wasn't a magic fix, but it helped me peel away layers of pain. I learned to forgive myself for ever feeling I wasn't enough. I learned to let go of resentment toward my family, not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want the past to control me anymore. In Seattle, I began building a new life. I joined a hiking club where I met new friends who knew nothing about William or my past. They called me John, the engineer who loves talking about wind turbines. And I loved that nickname. I started hiking regularly, finding joy in conquering steep slopes, in the feeling of standing on a mountaintop and looking down at the vast world below. I also started dating, though cautiously. A colleague at Greenwave, Anna, a graphic designer with a radiant smile, invited me for coffee after a joint project. We talked about work, music, and silly dreams like starting a goat farm somewhere. For the first time, I felt I could open up without fear of comparison or judgment. By 2021, I was promoted to lead engineer at Greenwave. One of my projects, a low-cost solar panel system for rural schools, secured major funding from an investment firm. My name appeared in an industry article titled "Young Talents in Renewable Energy." Reading it, I didn't feel pride, just peace. I had found where I belonged. But the past didn't vanish entirely. One day I received a text from Emily. "Jonathan, I'm sorry for not speaking up that night," she wrote. "I want to meet, to talk." I stared at the message, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to reconnect with the bond we once had. But another part, the part that had learned to protect itself, reminded me that I didn't need my family to feel whole. I replied briefly, "Thanks, Emily. I'm doing okay. Maybe we'll talk someday." I set the phone down and looked out the window of my small apartment near Puget Sound. The steady rhythm of the waves mixed with the patter of rain on the roof, sounds that had become part of my life in Seattle. 2 years had passed since that Christmas Eve in 2019 when I left Lansing with a broken heart and a burning resolve. I had rebuilt my life, going from a man labeled a burden to the lead engineer at Greenwave Technologies, a rising startup in renewable energy. I had friends, a community, and a purpose. But Emily's message reminded me that no matter how far I'd come, the fragile threads tying me to my family still lingered. In 2022, at 33, my life in Seattle had settled. Greenwave had just secured a major investment from a Silicon Valley fund, and my low-cost solar panel project was implemented in 3 rural Washington schools. My name appeared in an industry magazine article titled "Young Talents in Renewable Energy." When Sarah sent me the article, she included a message. "You did it, Jonathan. Proud of you." I read the piece, saw the photo of myself standing next to a wind turbine model, and smiled. Not for the recognition, but because I knew I'd found my own path. But then, an unexpected opportunity brought me closer to my family, not in Lansing, but in Chicago, where William was building his illustrious career. Greenwave was invited to a tech conference in Chicago where energy companies and lawyers gathered to discuss environmental policies. My project was selected for a presentation, and Mark, my boss, insisted I go. "You're the one behind this project, Jonathan. Go show them what we can do," he said. I hesitated. Chicago was William's territory. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to face the past. But then I reconsidered. This wasn't about William or my family. This was about me, about what I'd built. I wasn't going to prove anything to them, but to affirm my own worth. I agreed, booked a flight, and prepared my presentation. Deep down, I knew this trip might reopen old wounds, but I was ready. The conference took place in a sleek, modern convention center in downtown Chicago, with gleaming glass walls and hundreds of people in sharp suits. I wore a simple blazer, not expensive but professional enough, and stood by a poster showcasing Greenwave's project. My presentation focused on the low-cost solar panel system, with data on how it saved schools thousands of dollars annually. As I began speaking, I felt the eyes of dozens of people, investors, engineers, lawyers, fixed on me. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I delivered the presentation smoothly, answering questions with a confidence I didn't know I had. When I finished, a group of investors approached, asking about scaling the project. One of them, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, handed me her business card and said, "You've got vision, Jonathan. Stay in touch." I gripped the card tightly, feeling like I'd just conquered a mountain. But then, I saw him. William, in an expensive gray suit, stood a few meters away, talking to a group of people. He noticed me, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw a flicker of surprise cross his face, then he smiled, that familiar, confident smile. He walked over, extending his hand. "Jonathan, didn't expect to see you here. You look different." I shook his hand but didn't smile. "Hey, William," I said evenly. He glanced at Greenwave's poster, then at me, as if trying to reassess who I was. "Your presentation. I was impressed." "Pretty good," he said, but there was a hint of awkwardness in his voice, lacking the smugness I was used to. He invited me to dinner, saying he wanted to reconnect. "It's been a while, Jonathan. We should talk," he said, sounding sincere. But I shook my head. "I'm busy, William. There are people here who actually value me," I replied, then turned to join the group of investors waiting for me. I didn't look back, but I felt his eyes on me. This time I didn't need his approval. I had my own. A few weeks after the conference, I received an email from my mother. Subject: "Proud of you." My heart tightened as I read the words. I opened the email and read her message. "William told me about the conference in Chicago. I didn't realize you were doing such great things. Your father and I are proud of you. Emily's struggling with tuition debt. Could you help her out a bit?" I read it over and over, a mix of anger and sadness swirling inside me. Proud? They were proud now when my name appeared in an article, when I was no longer a burden? And yet they still asked for money, as if I were a financial resource rather than a son. I replied briefly, "Thanks, Mom, but I disappeared like you wanted. Now I'm living for myself." I hit send, feeling like I'd just closed a door. Emily called a few days later. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't stand up for you that night, and I regret it. I want to see you to start over." I listened, sensing the sincerity in her voice. Emily wasn't like my parents or William. She was just caught in the family's crossfire, as I once was. "Thank you, Emily," I said. "I forgive you. But I need time. I've found a new family here and I'm doing well." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I understand. Just know I'm always here." William sent a long text a few weeks later, admitting he'd underestimated me. "I didn't realize what you went through," he wrote. "I'm sorry, Jonathan. If you want, we can start over." I read the message but didn't reply right away. I wasn't angry at him anymore, but I didn't need him to feel whole. I had Sarah, Anna, Mark, and my hiking club friends, people who valued me for who I was, not for how I measured up to someone else. I sent William a short reply. "Thanks, William. I'm fine. Wishing you the best." I didn't close the door completely, but I set boundaries. I'd learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who see your worth and stay by your side. The Chicago conference wasn't just a career opportunity. It was a milestone. I returned to Seattle with newfound confidence. Greenwave entrusted me with leading a larger project, designing an energy system for an indigenous community in Alaska. I worked day and night, not just for the job, but because I believed in it. Every wind turbine, every solar panel was a way for me to leave a mark, to prove I could make a difference. Coming back from Chicago, I felt like I'd crossed an invisible threshold. Seattle was no longer just a place I'd fled to escape my past. It had become home, where I truly belonged. My small apartment near Puget Sound, with its window overlooking the sea and the steady sound of waves, was where I began each day with a clear purpose. I no longer woke up fearing comparison or feeling like a burden. Instead, I woke up thinking about wind turbines spinning in a remote village, about children in Alaska studying under lights powered by systems I designed. For the first time in my life, I felt I was living, truly living, not just existing. The Alaska project was the biggest challenge I'd ever faced. The indigenous community in Kotzebue needed a sustainable energy system to replace costly, polluting diesel generators. I led a team of 5 engineers collaborating with tribal elders to ensure the system met their needs and respected their culture. Field trips to Alaska were frigid, with winds so strong they could knock me over, but standing before a newly installed turbine filled me with indescribable pride. At the dedication ceremony, an elder, Mr. Aklak, took my hand and said, "You brought light to us, not just electricity, but hope." Those simple, heartfelt words were a reward greater than any accolade. Work wasn't everything. In Seattle, I continued building a life I once thought I didn't deserve. Anna, the girl with the radiant smile, became a vital part of my world. We started dating officially, and evenings spent walking along the coast or sitting in small coffee shops, talking about everything from work to silly dreams, brought me a sense of ease. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching a fiery sunset over Puget Sound, Anna turned to me and said, "Jonathan, you know you make things better just by being you." I held her hand, saying nothing, but a warmth surged within me. I didn't need to prove anything to her, and that was truly liberating. Sarah remained a close friend, always there with timely encouragement. She invited me to join a Green Wave-sponsored charity project, teaching technical skills to unemployed youth in Seattle. I began spending weekends guiding young people in repairing machines, designing circuits, and basic programming. Watching a teenager's eyes light up when he fixed an engine for the first time, I saw myself in Uncle Fred's garage years ago. "You did it, Jason," I said, patting his shoulder. "Keep going and don't let anyone tell you you're not good enough." By helping them, I was also healing myself. But true growth wasn't just in external successes, it was in how I learned to let go. In therapy sessions with Dr. Elena, I gradually unraveled the remaining layers of pain from my past. One day she asked, "If you could say one thing to your 2019 self, what would it be?" I thought for a moment, then answered, "I'd say, you're worthy of love, of being seen. Don't wait for someone to validate you. Validate yourself." Elena smiled and nodded. "Have you done that yet, Jonathan?" I nodded. "I'm doing it." I started journaling, a habit I picked up from therapy. Each evening I sat by my window, writing about what I'd done, how I felt. One entry read, "Today I finished a design for a new turbine. Today Anna laughed at my silly story. Today I hiked with the club and felt free. I don't need Mom, Dad, or William to tell me I'm enough. I know I'm enough." Those simple words were proof of my inner victory. My family, though no longer the center of my life, had their own changes. Emily kept in touch through short texts, sharing updates about her job at a small advertising agency. She was trying to stand on her own, no longer relying on our parents as before. Once she sent me a photo of herself in front of her new office, with the caption, "I did it, Jonathan. Thanks for always being a good brother." I smiled and replied, "Proud of you." I no longer held a grudge for her silence years ago. She too had been a victim of our family's culture of comparison, and I was glad she was finding her own path. My parents sent a few more emails, mostly polite check-ins. They stopped asking for money but never offered a direct apology. I didn't expect them to. I'd learned to accept that they might never understand what I went through, and that was okay. I didn't need their validation to move forward. In early 2025, I bought a small apartment near Puget Sound, paid for entirely with my own earnings. It wasn't large, but it was mine. A bright space with hiking photos on the walls and a work corner filled with technical drawings. Anna moved in with me and we started talking about the future. Not grand plans, but simple things like traveling together or adopting a dog. I took on more charity projects, expanding the technical training program for unemployed youth, feeling like I was giving back to the community that gave me a chance. One morning, I joined the hiking club for a climb up Mount Rainier. The trail was treacherous with snow-covered slopes and biting winds. But standing at the summit, looking down at the lush valleys and drifting clouds, I felt a freedom I'd never known before. I pulled out my journal and wrote, "Sometimes to be seen, you have to leave the places where only your shadow is noticed. Your worth lies in the life you choose to build, not in the eyes of those who never truly saw you." My victory wasn't in awards or articles. It was in how I learned to love myself, to stand tall after years of being pushed down. My father's cruel words, "If you disappeared, no one would notice," had once been a knife to my heart, but now they were my motivation. I had disappeared from their world, not to escape, but to find myself. And in this new world, I was the center, not anyone's shadow.